Okay. For 9 o'clock, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got a bit of a smaller group with some people who are traveling. So I encourage for those of you who are not able to attend to continue watching if you're watching the recording. For everybody else, thank you for coming in. This is our last class meeting face-to-face for a little bit. And this is our last class meeting before the informative speeches begin next week. So as a reminder to everybody, on Monday, please do not come in here. So on Monday, you could use the space if you wanted to for your speech, but I will not be in here. You're not required to use this room. Monday's class should be using the Zoom link that's available on the front page of Canvas, right? So if you go here right to the front page, I know a couple of people have already clicked the link to get on, like Chris. If you click here, Zoom link to class on informative speech days, that will get you into that Zoom meeting. You're welcome to test that before you get in. Another thing that you can do from your MyEOU account is go to Zoom, and then you can use that to create your own test room. That's a great way, like creating a personal room or test room is a great way for you to practice using some of the tech, such as screen sharing, and practice that material to get yourself ready to go. So I definitely recommend using that to help you to prepare. So our informative speeches are going to be all of next week. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Monday and Wednesday of the week after that. So we'll be meeting through Zoom for those class meetings. And then we'll be coming back after that for the preparation for the final speech in the course, which is the persuasive speech. So we'll be moving back into class for that one. So we took some time last class to talk about the informative speech assignment, what I'm looking for, how it'll be graded, some of the expectations and rubric, which you're welcome to refer to as you're working on the speech. If you have any ideas that you'd like to run by me, if you have an outline that you would like to send to me or anything else like that or review, please let me know and I'm happy to look that over. We also took some time to talk about the informative speaking genre. This is a great starting point if you find yourself a little bit unsure of what to give your speech about, right? You might be thinking about people, places, things. It was fun to read over some of your ideas from last class. Some people had figures that they were really interested in talking about. Some people had their own like hobbies or activities or clubs or sports that they're into, which are really good starting points for this speech too. So as a reminder, 6 to 8 minutes, that gives you a lot more time to work with, but also a lot more wiggle room in terms of incorporating material and pacing yourself. I encourage you, again, to use at least 3 outside sources. These could be, for example, statistics, evidence, they could be personal testimony, examples, and so on, right? But they should be verbally given in your speech, and you should be including in text works cited in your outline for that. We are, if you're not speaking that day, taking attendance as normal. I'll instead ask you to complete the activity online and send that to me. And then if you are speaking, I'll ask you to email me your outline before you're scheduled to speak. I encourage you to find a space that works for you and that you've been able to test. Right, there are a lot of spaces on campus that can be really good choices. You might also book out a space such as a conference room or smaller space at EOU, or use a classroom that is not currently being occupied and you know would not be occupied during the period of class. If you're running into issues with finding a space, please let me know so that I can help you out. You'll be able to use that for giving the speech. We'll take a lot of time today to talk a little bit about some of the best practices of speaking online and ways of doing that effectively. So as a reminder, folks who are scheduled to speak on Monday will be Annika, Kate, Devin, Skylar, and Ferris. If you are looking at your speech schedule and you see that you are not able to speak on that day, please let me know as soon as possible. So we'll be going through March 1st, and then on Friday, March 3rd, we'll be returning back to class to start to talk about persuasive speaking. Remember that the goal of informative speaking is education, right? You're like a teacher, you're like a reporter. You might think about it like you're giving a TED Talk, right? You are somebody who has developed expertise in an area, and you're conveying that expertise and that background to your audience. In other words, right, you should not be sharing a Wikipedia summary. You should not be sharing general knowledge, right? You should be integrating that supporting material and additional sources in order to bolster your main points. So today, we'll be talking a little bit more about the use of visual aids. We'll be talking a little bit about how you can prepare to speak online effectively. We'll be talking about some of the ways that can be applied to more professional communication. One of the chapters that I have assigned for the gun book is about speaking in professional settings, workplace settings. So we'll be talking a little bit about some of those ideas in more detail. So for the informative speaking assignment, I am asking you to integrate visual aids in some capacity, right? And when you're thinking about this class, and more generally, like you're giving a presentation for another class, you're being asked to present in a workplace setting, there are a lot of different reasons why the use of visual aids can really enhance your speech and be a good skill to develop. One of the key reasons is that it helps us to grasp complex ideas, right? If you're trying to explain to us, the biological makeup of a woolly mammoth, right? You're talking about a historical example about like the archaeology and findings about the woolly mammoth species, right? That's a very difficult thing for us just to imagine in our own heads. So presenting us with a diagram of a woolly mammoth, showing us the different parts and how those different parts have been studied and understood about this species, right? Could be a really good way for us to break it down. You might be familiar with the classic phrase, a picture says 1,000 words. And in the same way, including some type of visual can really help break those things down. The speech by Jordan that we saw on Wednesday talking about hair, right, was a really good example. She could have gone on a very lengthy description about how the waviness of hair follicles in African-American people is very different, but having that visual depiction made it a lot easier for us to understand. It's more efficient use of your time, it's interesting, right, and it helps to break down those ideas. It also helps us to organize our thoughts, right? When we see a visual aid, it's almost like including a heading or a key point in your outline. You see the visual and then you think, oh yeah, that point. And you get to talk about that and break that down a little bit. So think about it as a prompt to yourself. Now the downside is reading off of a PowerPoint, right, or only letting that be the source of your visual aid, right? You probably had a class in which somebody only reads off of a PowerPoint. That's a bad practice, right? I like to use PowerPoints and I like to glance at them to get a prompt as what to say next, but if I was only reading, that would not be particularly engaging, right? So think about those as a starting point. And the use of visual aids is a way to signpost, right? It's a way to show when you're moving between points. One thing that I think is incredibly important about visual aids is they should only be there for as long as they're relevant. In other words, right, don't plaster on an image at the very beginning of your speech that you don't talk to until 3 minutes in. It's like a distraction. Why does anybody care? Why does anybody understand the visual aid? And if you're not talking about it or using it, right? People are going to be distracted. They're going to be confused. Why is this here? What's this have to do with anything? And you let that take away time and focus from yourself, right? Bring it in. And then when you're done, don't let it linger, right? Take the visual aid out. You might conceal it. You might disable the screen share. You might move to a blank slide, right? Including blank slides and something like a PowerPoint is a really, really helpful resource that helps to kind of clear the palette, make the focus back on you and back on your own speaking. So while we'll be doing this over Zoom for this class, there are a lot of opportunities for different types and styles of visual aids that you can incorporate. One of them is the use of a prop or physical object. You saw that last class from Jordan, right? So Jordan was including some of those boards, right, that you would stick off and they would show different things, like when she was showing a lot of prominent celebrities and figures and the hair that they wore, right? She had this black piece of board, and then she would take parts of it off as she was showing us the different details, right? That's one way to incorporate a physical object, but you might think about an example of a prop that actually makes sense for your own speech, right? So for instance, one example here would be to include the use of something, an object that's relevant to the content of your speech. For instance, if you play lacrosse, right, you might show us a lacrosse stick and like bring that into the frame. So using a physical object can be used for this speech. The trick is just to bring it in close enough so that we can see it from your camera. Secondarily, our pictures, right? The pictures can be included. If you're using slides, right, including an image is useful. For this speech, it's a good idea that you're able to trace, if you pulled an image from the internet, right, to that source that you're using in your reference list. That helps us to make sure we're able to trace this. If we were to show you a statistic and you didn't know where that statistic was coming from, then we might be skeptical about the credibility of the speech. When was it published? Who funded it? Where does the study come from? Right? Including those details is important for us to understand images. Another thing you can do is you can also physically print out a picture if you would like to, and then bring that into the frame. If you don't want to mess around with slides, if you don't want to mess around with screen sharing, printing out and showing us a picture can actually be a really good way to include relevant visual material in your speech. Multimedia, right? So the inclusion of something like Prezi or some type of slideshow can be useful. But another thing you can incorporate is the use of something like a video. Now, there are a couple things that I think are important to know about the inclusion of videos. First of all, if you're pulling up a video from YouTube, right, you might notice that before class, every class, I always pull up the video before class starts. There's a couple reasons that I do that, and one of the big reasons is that it helps us to avoid ads that might play ahead of time, right? I also like to do that in an incognito because that prevents like things such as specific related videos from coming up, right? So if you are really into lacrosse and there's a whole bunch of related videos about lacrosse specifically, that can be a distraction from the points that you're trying to make. And another thing to think about when you're using video is that it should not occupy very much time in the speech, right? The cheat is if your speech is 6 minutes and you occupy 4 of those with a video and don't do any talking. So don't do that. In fact, I would ask that you cap the amount of time that you spend on a video, if you are including a video in this class, to about 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds at most. You've got 6 minutes to speak. It should not be occupying a whole lot of real estate, but it can be used to enhance and build upon a main point. An aid should help, not overwhelm, right? I always like to think about, like, if you've watched any of the like detective shows where they open up the garage and there's this like elaborate, you know, there's all the images and there's the little like string that's used to connect the pieces together, right? Or there's the meme that's Charlie from Always Sunny who's doing the same thing and like trying to talk about this massive diagram. If your visual aids are really large, if they have a whole lot of details and components, then we're not going to know where to start. There's a good chance that many of those details are not relevant to the content of your speech. So I encourage you to pare those things down. You can even edit images that are too large to break it down into the key things that people need to know, right? Only include the amount of visual aids that are directly relevant to the speech, to the content of the speech, right? Visual aids don't speak for themselves. It's your job to tell us what this speech is doing and how this visual aid is adding to and being incorporated into that speech, right? So have visual aids serve rather than substitute your own speech. And then when it comes to how you're presenting and including visual aids, also be cautious. This won't be relevant to this class, but be cautious about how, if you're using a handout, that gets incorporated as a distraction. I've seen a lot of speeches where somebody might hand something out, for example, like a show and tell, hey, here's this ball that I use for my sport, check it out. Or people are handing out things like pieces of paper to show to other people. The trick with doing that is that if you give a handout people are going to be more focused on being the next one to get it and passing it around to other people, that they're going to lose focus on the speech itself, right? So try to refocus, and instead you might give handouts after the speech. That can be a good practice that prevents the distractions from happening. It can also be a good way to remind us about what you talked about. When it comes to visual aids, right, bigger is better, right? The inclusion of larger visual aids allows us to better see the image. You have this tiny, tiny picture that doesn't scale up very properly and looks really pixelated. That's not going to be a good choice. If you have this tiny little image that we can't see, like a prop, and you need to bring it in toward the camera, that can also help to enhance the quality of the speech, right? Including a larger visual aid, including an image that scales up, including vector-based images. Vectors, right, will scale appropriately, will maintain their size and quality. Those can be good options. Using consistency in font, right? So I teach this class this term, and I also teach small group communication. I use the same slide template, but it's blue for this class and orange for small group, right? So that helps me to visually distinguish the two, but it also makes sure that things are able to look consistent. If you are directly pasting material, then there's a good chance that the font, the text color, all of that material is going to be different, right? So the trick that I encourage people to do is to paste without formatting. That's an option if you right-click and paste into a document. Another option that tends to work really well is to copy something, to paste it into something like Notepad or something neutral that removes any formatting, and then paste that text into your file, right? So consistency in font is important. Make sure to verify that. Avoid overloading, right? Don't include too many details or points, right? Don't be like Charlie with all of the, things everywhere. Avoid looking at your aids whenever you can, right? So while you can use those briefly as a prompt, or you can show us, right, the different parts of the visual aid. Try to avoid just reading off of the visual aid. Another thing to think about here is about accessibility, right? So a lot of online content has started to include alt text or description. You might include a verbal description of the image as you're giving the speech that helps people who are blind or might have vision impairments be able to see what's going on, right? Alt text or captions are oftentimes used in things like videos to help make that clear and more accessible. Also, a number of folks are red-green colorblind, right? Which means that you have to be careful about the color scheme and coding that you use. If you're giving, for example, a pie chart and you're using red and green to distinguish the colors and help us see things, one option that can help make things more accessible is to also include a change in the texture. For example, maybe the red part has polka dots and the green part has stripes. That helps us to make that material more accessible too, right? Accessibility features have been increasingly discussed, increasingly important as an expectation for visual aids in presentation. Another good idea here is to print handouts in case your visual aids don't work properly, right? If you're presenting online, it's a good idea to print out those slides in advance. Also, if you are giving a presentation, printing out slides in advance, if you're presenting face-to-face, can be great if there are people who are toward the back who are not able to see or need additional help, right? You print out the slides, you give them out to people in advance, and that way they're able to better see them. That way, if I was trying to present content to like Alofa or to Austin, right, I would be able to use the visual aids more effectively. One thing I encourage, especially if you use Google Slides, please download it. Download it before your speech. If you download material ahead of time, that can help the speech go a lot better. A lot of times the links that you might use, like a hyperlink, don't work because it's the internet. Things are very malleable. Web pages get taken down, right? Servers go down. So I encourage you to download and save stable versions of things rather than rolling the dice that the internet has those, right? We've seen a lot of crashes and outages over the years from a lot of larger companies, right? We've seen entire outages of like Facebook, Google, and so on. So be careful about that material. Your audience appreciates you thinking on your feet, right? So my first day of small group communication, The custodial staff had unplugged the visual display. So I pulled it up on my computer, right? I typically include my computer that has a copy of this so that I could go through the material despite not having that there visually. Being able to adapt to things happening while you're making plans is important. Avoiding death by PowerPoint is an important idea, right? Break it up. So if you're including slides or PowerPoint, that doesn't necessarily need to be for the whole speech, right? Maybe you have a slide, maybe there's something you want to screen share, cool, you're done. And that doesn't need to be there anymore, right? Or make sure that you're mixing things up with how you're presenting material. And as mentioned, don't let the handouts or slides become a distraction. Don't let it become people who are trying to figure out, where are the handouts? Where do I need to go get one? Where do I need to pass them to? So what I'd like you to do is, for part one of your attendance, you can write or type this. I'd like you to think back to some of the ideas that you developed for your informative speeches, or between last class and now, if you've thought of any new ideas that you've developed, I'd like you to think about what types of visual aids you might use to bolster your speech or your main points. If you have a device with you, but you might even take a moment to look at some possible visual aids that you can incorporate here. So where would it be appropriate for you to include those visual aids, right? You might think here about the content of your speech. What are the main points that you want to convey? And what would help you? What would be a good type of visual aid to include? Maybe it's a physical prop that you're showing us. Maybe it's the use of an image. And start to think about how that supporting material could enhance your speech. Give people a couple more minutes to think about this. If you are thinking about including a speech that involves some type of demonstration component, one really cool thing you could do is record a short clip of yourself. Like if you're trying to show us the different strokes in tennis, one way to do that would be to show us that during the speech. But if you were trying to stand or you were at a different location, you could always show us a short clip of like actually doing a tennis stroke in a game as a way of adding to the points that you give, right? So using something like a video does not necessarily have to be something from another source. It could be something from you. And in doing that, you could add to the speech and show good preparation. All right, so hang on to this. I'll be asking you to turn in part 2 a little bit later. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of speaking online, right? Because this is useful not only for our ability to present for this class, but we are inevitably going to have to speak, present, and participate online. We have noticed over the last several years, right? Things moved remote, and some things came back face-to-face, but other things have remained remote. So we'll probably find ourselves involved in virtual meetings. And if you are anything like me, you probably found yourself frustrated over the last several years with how poorly a lot of the online and remote meetings were run, and how bad the communication became in some of those meetings. In fact, I showed this off in my small group communication class. A couple of people got a hoot out of it. It's a Zoom bingo card, right? So the idea is that when you're in a Zoom meeting, you take note of all of these things that come up. For example, hey, I have another call to go to. I'm going to turn over to blank. Blank, you're muted. Oh, I think we lost blank. Some of those things, like an off-topic conversation in the chat. Somebody's mic isn't muted when it should be. So there are so many like recurring tropes and problems that you likely encountered over the process of being in remote meetings. But the thing is, right, a lot of employers, industry professionals, that stuff doesn't fly anymore, right? So the expectation is professionally that you come in with a skill set that does not involve doing those tropes or aspects of bad virtual communication, right? So it still happens, but generally the threshold of acceptable content online has gotten a little bit higher. So there are a lot of different issues that we come to think about when it comes to presenting and speaking online, right? One of the biggest ones is tech issues related to the speaker. For example, perhaps the speaker is muted, right? And you have like a professor who's been muted for a half hour and people are using the chat and trying to tell them to unmute. Know how to use the chat or anything else, so it's a total waste of time. Also, there might be a speaker that's not visible or able to be heard, right? So one thing that's important to do is to check in advance, especially if you're using multiple devices, as to which speaker you have connected, because if you have multiple speakers, sometimes it can default to a different one, or sometimes it can default to your headphones, even if your headphones don't have speaker capabilities on them. So one thing that I did was I bought a separate speaker to use for presenting online because it was better than my laptop speaker. You don't need to do that, but I do encourage you to think about and test your audio. You might record yourself, hear yourself back, and check in with our IT department if you find yourself in need of additional resources. Another issue can be tech issues with the audience, right? You can have people who are coming into meetings, then stepping out of the meeting, right? Or having difficulty with connecting and staying online. That could be a big problem. One thing that you might think about here is if you're involved in a meeting like that's related to EOU, if you are connected to the EOU internet and there's a tech issue that comes up, that's a lot easier to be traced, and it's a lot easier to be honest and accountable about that, because they can say, oh yeah, there was an outing here, right? And I can report that that was at the time when you were scheduled to speak, right? So you save your own butt if you are using like EOU internet if you're giving an EOU speech, right? So you might consider that on campus because that allows the responsibility to not solely be on you for those tech issues. Another problem is knowing your audience, right? So speaking and presenting into the ether, not really knowing who you're talking to or anything about the people. So if you're giving a longer presentation, generally speaking, it's a good idea to give introductions and get to know the other people, right? It's also important to connect, right? Oftentimes in online presentations and speaking, there are a lot of different ways to engage with the audience. One easy way to do that is to use the chat feature. Another is to request people to turn the video on. Another is to ask people to verbally respond to messages, right? And still another strategy that you could use is to use something like a polling feature, right? So polling is something that Zoom meetings do allow. I have to set up a poll in advance. So if you plan to use that for your speech, let me know in advance and let me know what you need filled in. But that can also be an option to connect. Being engaging. We're in this flat two-dimensional space. Inevitably, it's going to be a little bit less interesting, which means that you have to offset that by being more engaging with your presentation, with your delivery style, with your verbal and nonverbal gestures, and tone of voice. So that can be an issue too. And also thinking about reproducing content, right? So if your entire speech is a video that you got off of YouTube, then that doesn't really work for the content of the speech. So I encourage you to think about how you're using outside content in a way that can really bolster your main points. So an online presentation, right, using some type of device in order to convey something that could be a prepared speech that you're giving. It could be something like a podcast, video cast, right? So if you're a fan, like I listened to Serial when that was really popular, right? Kind of, is this person innocent or guilty? That can be an example of presenting online, or a video on a device, right? So sometimes you might hear about a webinar, which involves somebody giving a lecture or presentation that's using a device to communicate. If you're like me, you have absolutely grown sick of these terms, but I think it's important for us to think about the difference between synchronous and asynchronous, right? Synchronous means that it is happening online, but it is happening in real time. So if you were taking a class or if you registered for a class that was marked as remote, that means that that is a class that is meeting synchronously, but it might be meeting online, right? So that is different from an online class, which is generally considered to be asynchronous, where it is written and presented ahead of time. You're working at your own pace. There isn't anything that you need to be there for live in real time. One advantage to synchronous presentation is you get to engage, right? You get to engage with your audience. For this class, we'll be giving a synchronous presentation. You will be giving the speech in class over Zoom. But an asynchronous presentation can carry an advantage of being polished and rehearsed, right? So my partner ran a nonprofit in Salt Lake City, and she actually got the mayor to create a recorded video for their annual convention, right? So recording a video was a good way for that mayor to be prepared to show polish, right? But it can mean that they're less engaged. It's not dynamic. It might not be able to read the room. So it's important for us to think about when that material is appropriate and makes sense. It's more detached, but also more polished if you're presenting material asynchronously. Video editing, that's something that people can do in an asynchronous style, right? That can disrupt the speech's flow. Suddenly it's cut to something else. That can be a good way, like if you're watching a TikTok, it can be a good way to get to the point and to cut out extraneous content, but it can also be a little bit jarring. Cuts can distract the audience and also be poor practice for face-to-face speeches, right? You don't get a cut when you're giving a synchronous speech, which means that you might get used to making multiple takes until you've got it right. But you've only got the one shot. And nobody's going to get that shot perfectly, but our ability to recover, adjust, and adapt is something that we don't necessarily get in the same way if we're able to practice and cut for every time. Other things to know with regard to presenting and speaking online. So as mentioned, a webinar is where there are people who are using software to connect, more seminar or lecture style. So there is a topic or issue that's being brought up in that setting. A screencast is somebody who is doing a broadcast of their computer or technology. So a good example of a screencast is when somebody is walking you through a technical issue or problem. There's a good chance that they would ask you to share your screen as a way of helping them to understand what's going on, or they might share their own screen to show you the steps needed to do something. And then a mediascape is, generally speaking, the landscape or setting that's enabled through technology. So we think about the use of social media as fulfilling that. One problem here is the idea of the amorphous audience. So we've talked a bit in this class about how it's important to know your audience and to connect with them. I think a lot of people did well in their celebratory speeches of recognizing you're talking to a set of college students in this class. You know that you will be for your informative speech. There are other things you don't know, like where they're speaking from, to what degree they're listening, and so on. So one of the challenges of being a good speaker online is that we don't necessarily know the details about the audience, who's in, and so on. Due to COVID, when I interviewed for EOU and I gave my job talk, my research presentation, right, it was delivered over Zoom. And so there were people in the meeting and I didn't know who everybody was. So one of the challenges is adapting to the audience at that much. You also have to think about publicity and circulation, right? If you have followed any celebrities and celebrity-related issues on Twitter, you know that whatever has been created on the internet and circulated and posted as a tweet will never go away, right? So you should treat the internet as something where you put something in and it will be screen capped, it will be circulated, it will be saved, it will be archived, it'll never truly go away. Got a lot of people in trouble, so I think it's good to remember that content on the internet will stay, right? You never really know how much something will circulate. I've been posting a few TikToks and I had this one, I would average on the lower end. And I had one that came up that got over 23,000 views in a few days. And I was shocked, right? I didn't even know who half the people are who were commenting. I'm still getting random comments. So that's an example of the amorphous audience. You don't necessarily know who all is going to reach you and reach the points that whatever algorithms have tried to curate. So it's important for us to think about that. Also important for us to think about the digital divide, right? So pictured here is a study from the Pew Research Center that was conducted in 2021. By the way, that's an example of a way you could incorporate a description for a visual aid and integrate a visual aid into a speech that identifies that for folks of lower socioeconomic status, right? Access to things like a computer, a smartphone, access to broadband, and internet is a lot lower. So I think one thing that's important for us to think about here is when we're adapting for our audience, to what degree are we accounting for that divide and helping to bridge that divide? For example, EOU library resources are a good way to bridge that divide and help people to engage with one another. You might have seen some speeches and presentations that use backgrounds, right? Backgrounds can be a good way to support your speech and account for the divide, right? If you are speaking in a setting such as a dorm room, or you're speaking in a more crowded or messy area, there are a lot of situations that might mean that you do not want other people to see your background. So you might include, like the tropical beach vacation Zoom background. Another option that you could include if you wanted to is to use the kind of blur effect, which means that we can see you, but the background behind you is not as clear, right? So be thinking about the use of background distractions. Whenever I am giving a Zoom presentation, I have to make sure that my cat is not like creeping into the frame. So thinking about how, pets might be in another room for a period of time, that can be a good way to manage the space. Aesthetics matter, right? Some elements that matter speaking online include things like lighting, they include color, they include the composition, movement, and background, what is going on in the area where you're presenting, and the use of sound, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can set up tech, but there are a couple things that I encourage. One thing that can be really good is to stand up, right? As you're giving your speech, like you would face-to-face. And then to set up the device that you're using in such a way that it's angled down to you. You might stack some books or organize material in that kind of way. What that allows you to do is have a lot more space in order to gesture and to communicate in that capacity, right? If you are just like sitting and you're right next to the camera like this, and all we can really see is your face, it's not necessarily dynamic in the same way, right? So I encourage you to put more distance between yourself and the camera as a way of helping us to engage with you very clearly. There's also what's known as 3-point lighting. That can be a good way to help make sure that you've got the lighting that you need. If you're a fan of taking photos and thinking about how lighting impacts photography, this might be familiar. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to have the camera angled in such a way that it aligns with your eyes. That's generally a good position for the camera to be in. There is what's known as key light, which is generally focused on you, right? It's a light that's near where you are. There is very low intensity light behind you. And then there's what's known as still light, which is about medium. You don't need to do an elaborate camera setup, but I do encourage you to test out your lighting, figure out, what place in the room or space you're using is the best. Try to make sure that the focus and lighting is on you and the lighting behind you is more minimal. That can be a good way to try to modulate the lighting in a way that works best. And it's a good idea to prepare for errors, right? Again, test. Use a practice room. Try using your visual aids for the first time, right? Before you give your speech. Don't use hyperlinks because hyperlinks will break. If you're using an image and the image has not been downloaded, but instead is an external link, there's a good chance that when you go to give your speech, that image is going to break, right? So it's a good idea to make sure that you are downloading that material. Making backups is important, right? So make a backup of your backup. Make sure that you are regularly saving your material. A reliable internet connection is a good idea. Again, think about it this way. If you pick a space on campus to give your speech, then if the internet gets no longer works, that's EOU's fault, not yours. And then practice using technology in your speech, right? Don't just say, oh, I'm going to have an image for this later, right? Use it with the image and practice what that's like so that you have a good sense of what to expect. I wanted to go over a few other tips using a video that help us better understand some aspects of speaking online too, that I think can be used really well here.
Number one, think about the setting that you are in. So when you're delivering an online presentation, really think about your background. What's behind you? You don't want anything that's too distracting. So not in the kitchen with all the kitchen crap behind you. You want something that's plain and that looks professional. Just use a backdrop like I'm using now. This is just a standard black backdrop. And you can buy these on Amazon and they're really not that expensive. The same, you can get a stand to hold your backdrop on as well. So I'd really consider investing in one of those if you're going to be doing more online presentations. Think about how quiet the area is that you're presenting in. So you don't want any background noise. Close the windows, make it as quiet as possible, because when you're presenting online, the sound is really important. And think about the lighting as well. So you want the space that you're in to be really well lit. So turn the lights on. If there's a window in the room that you're in, make sure that that is in front of you. And basically that no lighting source is directly behind you, because what you'll find is it will look like you're in darkness to the viewers. So really think about the setting that you're in. Number two, stand up. If you stand up, you will naturally deliver a much better presentation. You will look like you are performing. Far too often, when we sit and we watch an online presentation, we're watching somebody sat at a table, slunched down. It's hard to present from this point of view. It looks like they don't care. It's hard to retain somebody's attention when you look like that. So stand up and really give it a presentation style. It will shock the audience into listening, because most of what they see in online presentations is crap, and it will make them listen. So deliver a performance by standing up. Now, if you're going to stand up, you need to raise your laptop up higher so that the lens of the camera is in your direct eye line. You do not want to be looking down at your camera lens, because then all your audience can see is the inside of your nose cavity. So standing up will just naturally make you deliver a better presentation. And that is key when delivering a presentation online. You are still performing. So stand up and perform. Tip number 3, rehearse. You need to treat your online presentation as you would a presentation on a stage in front of 200 people. So practice, get set up, get the camera set up, and practice performing to that camera lens. Tip number 4, dress to impress.
I'll skip that one since we're not like formally assessing dress for this class, but it is a good idea to make sure in a professional context that your dress is appropriate to the situation and matches some of the lighting and background. So I think a couple of those tips are especially useful here. Thinking about standing to present, also angling the camera in such a way that you're able to do that. That's a good example, right, of a speech and presentation becoming more dynamic on the basis of the distance that they gave, their ability to gesture via standing and so forth. So really putting in that practice, that preparation. You don't need to buy a background. I don't ask or require that you purchase anything in order to give a presentation for this class, but you might use something like a blur background if that's useful to you. But to practice really trying to get that level of engagement that you might give in a face-to-face speech as well. Using energy, staying energetic, staying engaged, those are all important things here too, right? If you're sitting, there are ways that you can present effectively through the use of gestures, focus, eye contact, and so forth. It can be more challenging, but dealing with that burden can sometimes be useful. Speaking a bit further away, using gestures, again, it was as close of approximation as possible to somebody actually speaking face-to-face when we saw that presenter on. So for part 2 of attendance, what I'd like you to do is to think a little bit about how you could incorporate some good skills for online public speaking in this speech. So you might start to think about where you're going to give this speech, what setup you might need to do in order to have the best space to present this speech and so forth, right? So what are the things that you are going to do to prepare and create an environment that will work effectively for this speech? So as you're wrapping up, we took some time to talk today about visual aids, some of the ways to use those effectively, and some of the ways to give an effective online virtual presentation. I don't want you to go out and spend money or significantly compromise your space, just to provide some best practices and tips on how to present online effectively and give you an idea of some of the things that you can work on. We will have our speakers present next Monday. Again, Annika, Kate, Devin, Skylar, and Ferris, who will be meeting with us over Zoom, again, using that Zoom front page. Again, as a reminder, we are not meeting face-to-face on Monday. We are meeting in that Zoom link, and I'll send another Zoom link invite for Monday's class. Once you have finished this attendance activity, you're welcome to email or pass it forward if you haven't done so already. Have a great rest of your morning, and I will see you all again over Zoom next Monday. Yeah.
The most fun preparation for a speech I've ever done.
It's a good skill to work on, yeah.
March 10th.
Yes.
I put on that form, and so I don't know if that means I'll have to squeeze in my persuasive speech a little early, or
Yeah.
whatever works for.
Yeah, so you are actually in good shape because, thank you. The persuasive speech days are, we have the Wednesday the 8th, which will be before that time. So you'll be all set.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean. Spend all class texting. It was also last class. And then when I get your prompts, they have like nothing on this. But we go over that content in class and you don't listen during class, then your prompt doesn't reflect any engagement with what we've gone over during class. So I can't give you attendance if you don't participate. So